It's 1981, and kids across America are spending hours at arcades playing hits such as Pac-Man and Asteroids. They call this the golden age of arcade games, and legendary video game developer Nintendo was broke.
Mamma mia!
Nintendo had just suffered a financial loss after their most recently released arcade game called Radar Scope failed to make an impact in the US. Nintendo was a much smaller company in the 80s, so in order to stay afloat, they had to do what they had always done best: innovate. So Nintendo doubled down and repurposed their unsold inventory into a new game called Donkey Kong. Donkey Kong was an instant hit, and Nintendo had their very first big break. But looming on the horizon, hungry for a slice of that golden banana, was the OG himself, King Kong. This is the case of Donkey Kong versus King Kong, or officially, legally, Universal City Studios v. Nintendo. Donkey Kong was released on July 9th, 1981. A young Shigeru Miyamoto designed and directed the game, drawing inspiration from classic stories like Beauty and the Beast and, of course, King Kong. The game featured the characters Jumpman, Pauline, and a giant lovable ape named Donkey Kong. In 2 years, Donkey Kong had sold over 67,000 arcade cabinets in the US, and a total of 132,000 arcade cabinets across the US and Japan. At the height of its popularity, Donkey Kong had inspired a board game, ports to other consoles, counterfeits of the game, and a breakfast cereal.
Okay.
Donkey Kong was pumping out cash, but where there's money, there's greed. Donkey Kong's dominance in the market soon caught the attention of Universal City Studios president Sidney Sheinberg. Mr. Sheinberg was a Hollywood bigwig, perhaps best known for discovering Steven Spielberg. He also happened to be a lawyer, and he now had his legal sights on Nintendo. When he first saw Donkey Kong, he immediately noticed some similarities to King Kong. Namely, that they were both about a giant ape climbing a building while carrying a damsel in distress. Universal would make the argument that these similarities were a clear case of trademark infringement against King Kong. The history of who actually owns King Kong is kind of a legal mess. But relevant to our case, on December 6, 1976, a court granted the estate of the original creator of King Kong, Marion C. Cooper, the rights to the name, character, and story of King Kong, but the rights to the original 1933 film and its sequel, which Cooper had licensed out to RKO Pictures to produce, would remain with RKO. Shortly after that decision, Cooper's estate then sold the remaining rights to Universal for $200,000. The litigation history surrounding the rights to King Kong illustrates just how fierce companies fought for ownership of the icon. While Donkey Kong was gaining popularity in the 80s, it's hard to understate the cultural impact that King Kong had and continues to have to this day. Let's not forget that even Mr. Miyamoto drew inspiration from King Kong. So it's really not a surprise that Universal would want to protect their trademark, but there is some speculation that Universal's president, Mr. Sheinberg, had some ulterior motives. In David Sheff's book, Game Over, Press Start to Continue, Sheff supposes that Mr. Sheinberg also wanted to get into the video game market, and he eventually would a few years later through MCA's acquisition of infamous game publisher LJN, but we can see the first peel of that banana here with our case. Universal hadn't just gone after Nintendo. They also went after other video game companies for trademark infringement, companies like Coleco, Atari, and Tiger Electronics. It seemed like there was a specific target on video game manufacturers rather than Universal just wanting to protect their trademark. Alright, let's get to the good stuff. On a late night in April 1982, the president and founder of Nintendo of America, Minoru Arakawa, received from Universal a threat to sue Nintendo for trademark infringement of King Kong. In order to avoid litigation, Universal gave Nintendo just 48 hours to surrender all profits from selling Donkey Kong, and to destroy all copies in their possession. Mr. Arakawa immediately called Nintendo's attorney, Howard Lincoln, and informed him of Universal's threat. And with that, the battle between the fledgling Nintendo and the corporate giant Universal began. Attorney Lincoln had previously worked closely with Nintendo in tracking down Donkey Kong counterfeiters, and his successes there earned him Nintendo's trust. But despite his skill, Attorney Lincoln still knew that this was going to be an uphill battle. But sometimes, all it takes is a hunch. and Attorney Lincoln had a hunch early on that Universal didn't have as strong of a claim to King Kong as they had let on. But he couldn't prove it just yet. Coleco, having obtained a license from Nintendo to release Donkey Kong with their upcoming console, the ColecoVision, received a similar threat from Universal. In an effort to sort this matter out, Coleco would convince Nintendo to join them in a meeting with Universal. Nintendo obliged, and the two companies went to meet with Universal's attorneys at their office in LA. The meeting was tense, but Attorney Lincoln stood his ground against Universal, refusing to settle. He told them, "If you own King Kong and it is infringed by Donkey Kong, then we'll settle. But I'm not gonna buy the Brooklyn Bridge. First, you'll have to prove to me that you own King Kong." Posturing aside, Coleco wasn't so sure about where their case actually stood. After the meeting, they were noted saying to Nintendo, "What else can we do? The gorillas look the same, and the name is almost the same." It was looking like Coleco was gonna settle, and it turns out they already had before this meeting even took place. Universal had gotten to Coleco early, and Coleco was essentially doing Universal's dirty work by trying to pressure Nintendo into settling. Apparently there were some backroom dealings where Universal and Coleco entered a settlement of their own. Universal promised not to sue Coleco for selling Donkey Kong games, and in exchange, Coleco would pay Universal royalties for each Donkey Kong game sold. Universal had also dangled the promise of lower royalty rates and a potential investment into Coleco, if Coleco could convince Nintendo to settle. So now we know the real reason why Coleco invited Nintendo to this meeting in the first place. With one failed settlement conference in the books, Attorney Lincoln went back and did a bit of homework. Nintendo met again with Universal in June of 1982. At this time, Universal was under the impression that Nintendo finally wanted to settle, but Nintendo had other plans. There, in the middle of Universal's luxurious executive dining room, Attorney Lincoln said quite plainly, "It's simple. We have done a lot of research on this thing, looked at it from top to bottom, and we feel that there is no infringement. We have no intention of settling."
Yeah.
Well, that really set Mr. Scheinberg off. He told Nintendo that they were making a major mistake and that he had viewed litigation as a profit center. He got up to leave, and on his way out, Attorney Lincoln confidently called out to him and said, "Mr. Scheinberg, have a nice day." And that must have been the final straw, because Universal sued Nintendo in federal court for trademark infringement later that month, on June 29th, 1982, dragging the small company across the US all the way to New York. Attorney Lincoln recruited a prominent attorney from New York to handle the case, and his name was John Kirby. Attorney Kirby was an experienced litigator and wasn't afraid of taking on giant companies, having represented the likes of Pepsi and General Food. And with him on board, Nintendo spent the next 10 months preparing for trial. Everything was riding on this lawsuit, and Nintendo eventually found their golden argument. They discovered that Attorney Lincoln's original hunch was right. Universal didn't have as strong of a claim to King Kong as they had previously boasted. Remember that case from earlier that granted the estate of King Kong's original creators some of the rights to King Kong? It turns out that a man named Delos W. Lovelace wrote a novelization of the original 1933 King Kong movie, and that novelization came out 2 months before the movie. On top of that, the judge made a ruling on November 24th, 1976 that the novelization was in the public domain because the book's copyright had expired. This meant that anyone could adapt the original King Kong novelization. And the cherry on top of this banana split? Universal was the one that made the public domain argument in the first place because they had wanted to make a King Kong movie. And it was with this revelation that Nintendo knew that their Kong still had some fight in it.
Walnuts, peanuts, pineapple smells, grapes, melons, orange.
Confident in their argument, Nintendo motioned for summary judgment, which, if there are no disputed facts, is a way to ask the court to decide a case without a trial. On August 8, 1983, the parties convened for the motion hearing, and Nintendo made their argument to Judge Robert Sweet. Remarkably, Judge Sweet actually agreed with Nintendo, or rather Universal, since it was essentially their argument from 7 years ago. The judge found that the original story of King Kong did indeed belong in the public domain, and while Universal did own some rights to King Kong, they could not claim an absolute ownership of King Kong. And because the original book was in the public domain, anyone could create a similar concept featuring a giant ape. And that's exactly what Nintendo had done. But Universal had another argument ready. They argued that audiences could confuse Donkey Kong for King Kong, and they presented some pretty flimsy evidence to back that claim up, one of which was a survey showing that only 18% of arcade operators believed that Donkey Kong had been approved by the owner of King Kong. Nintendo countered this argument in an interesting way by showing the differences between the two Kongs. Nintendo summoned Game Master Jerry Momoda to demonstrate to the court what exactly Donkey Kong was all about. And I mean that they literally hauled in Donkey Kong and Donkey Kong Jr. arcade cabinets into federal court so that Game Master Momoda could play the games for Judge Sweet. And it should go without saying, but the judge did find this display pretty entertaining. Ultimately, Judge Sweet disagreed with Universal that consumers could confuse the two Kongs, noting that King Kong was a ferocious gorilla on a violent rampage ending in his tragic death, whereas Donkey Kong was a game featuring silly obstacles, a colorful palette, and playful sounds. Judge Sweet stated, "At best, Donkey Kong is a parody of King Kong, but a parody of this sort is not an infringement." In the end, Judge Sweet granted Nintendo's motion for summary judgment and tossed out Universal's case. Universal's backroom dealings, bullying, and their view of litigation as a profit center finally came back to haunt them, and their appeal to the decision went nowhere. But Nintendo wasn't done. It was their turn to punch down, and Nintendo launched a countersuit. That case shed light on the dirty backroom deals Universal had pressured onto Nintendo's partners like Coleco. Universal was ordered to hand over all of their ill-gotten royalties from their settlements and to pay Nintendo's massive legal bills. By the end of the saga, Universal's antics had cost them millions of dollars, and instead of crushing Nintendo, they'd helped build them into the powerhouse that they are today. Nintendo had won, and they were eternally grateful to the attorneys that saved them. Attorney Howard Lincoln became the senior vice president of Nintendo, and later, a chairman of the company. Some might say, a real top banana. Attorney John Kirby received a 27-foot sailboat named Donkey Kong, and they gave him the exclusive worldwide rights to use the name for sailboats. And, as an additional surprise, the iconic Nintendo character Kirby was named after him. And as for Mr. Sidney Sheinberg, well, he was still rich. But at the end of the day, this was all just business. Down the line, Universal would distribute Nintendo's Super Mario movies, and they would build Super Nintendo World right in the middle of their Universal Studios theme parks, where they proudly displayed Donkey Kong for all to enjoy.